The Detroit and Toledo Shoreline Railroad is a historic railroad that operated in northwestern Ohio and southeastern Michigan. The Pleasant Bay Railway was incorporated in Michigan in March 1898 and purchased the Toledo and Ottawa Beach Railway, an Ohio company, incorporated in January 1898. In March 1899, the resulting company was renamed the Detroit and Toledo Shoreline Railroad. 1 month later, it operated a multi-track mainline connecting Detroit, Michigan and Toledo, Ohio, serving several large industries. The mainline between the two cities opened in 1903. The Grand Trunk Western Railway and the Toledo, St. Louis and Western Railroad co-owned the railroad from 1902 to 1923. The TSDL and AMP-W ownership was transferred to its successor, the New York, Chicago and St. Louis Railroad, in 1923, and then to the Norfolk and Western Railway in 1964. The GTW purchased the N and AMP-W's interest in the DTS in 1981. At that time, the DTS was dissolved and merged into the GTW. History: the D and AMP-TSL operated 46.98 miles of line between Toledo, Ohio, and Detroit, Michigan, a bridge route connecting the Motor City with the rail gateway of Toledo. Prior to the 1960s mergers resulting in Penn Central Transportation and the Norfolk and Western Railway, the link between these two cities was vitally important to the independent railroads in the area, particularly the GTW and the Nickel Plate. In 1960, it reported 243 million net ton-miles of revenue freight. The D and AMP-TSL was originally incorporated as the Toledo and AMP-Ottawa Beach Railway in Ohio and the Pleasant Bay Railway in Michigan. In March 1899, the two companies conveyed all the property to a new company incorporated under the Michigan law as the Detroit and AMP-Toledo Shore Line. The intent was to construct the railroad as a high-speed interurban connecting link between the Lakeshore Electric at Toledo and interurban lines in Michigan. Immediately following the purchase of the right-of-way, they began the actual grading of the road and construction of the Ottawa River Bridge just north of Toledo. From April to December 1901, the road was built from Toledo to Trenton, with trolley wires in place from Monroe to Trenton. Electric cars were tested a few times as far north as Rockwood. The line was still incomplete when its promoters got into serious financial difficulty. The Shore Line went into receivership, and in the summer of 1902 the receiver became convinced that it would never be viable as an electric road and petitioned the court to allow him to construct a connection from the end of the track at Trenton Junction to the nearby Detroit, Toledo and AMP-Ironton. This was completed in November 1902, and the construction work ceased for a short period. In December 1902, the Trunk Western and the Toledo, St. Louis and AMP-Western entered into an agreement to jointly purchase the shoreline property by issuing bonds for the payment of outstanding obligations. At the same time, they contracted to extend the line northward from Trenton to a connection with the Wabash at River Rouge, on the south side of Detroit. The new owners intended to bring the shoreline up to the same general standards as the Grand Trunk Main Line, a task that would require considerable additional track work. When the line was completed, the D and AMP-TSL had no equipment except a small locomotive which had been purchased from the contractor and an old dummy saddle tank engine that had formerly run on the New York City Elevated. There was some work equipment consisting of Rogers ballast cars but no cabooses or any freight equipment. Only one station had been constructed at Monroe, but there were a few telephone shanties scattered along the road. The overhead wire was removed and sold along with the electric motor cars to the Monroe Traction Company and the Toledo and AMP Monroe Construction Company. The line was opened for freight traffic in September 1903, with each parent company furnishing 3 locomotives. The D&AMP-TSL used the Cloverleaf Terminal in Toledo and the GTW facility in Detroit. There were no passing tracks, no classification yards, and no locomotive servicing facilities. To reach the Cloverleaf yard in Toledo, they used 12 miles of the Toledo terminal under a trackage rights agreement. In the spring of 1904, they bought 6 Baldwin compound moguls along with 6 cabooses. Work began immediately to upgrade the right-of-way. In 1906, a classification yard named Lang Yard after the road's auditor was started just north of the Toledo city limits, along with a roundhouse, turntable and machine shop. A short time later, work began on another yard at the other end of the railroad. Road Yard was just south of the River Rouge at Detroit. Over the years, additional equipment was purchased and many improvements were made as the shoreline developed into a vital and prosperous property. Ironically, for a road conceived as an interurban, the D&AMP-TSL never handled any passenger traffic, being operated for freight service only. In 1922, the Cloverleaf became part of the Van Swearingen's nickel plate, bringing its 50% interest in the D&AMP-TSL under the NKP banner. Through service with the GTW was inaugurated in 1921, and until the early 1940s Shoreline Power and Cruise operated through to Durand and Flint. They also operated through to Tunnel Yard in Port Huron until 1971. Motive power. In the later days of steam, the Shoreline operated with a modest fleet of Mikados, consolidations, and switches. It brought its first diesels, EMDSW7 switches 116 to 118, in April 1950 and followed them with 2 EMDGP7S each in January and November of 1951. A single SW9 was also added in March 1951. 5 more GP7s were delivered in April 1952, and the last D&AMP-TSL steam locomotive operated in the fall of that year. 2 more SW9s were added in November 1952, and the Shoreline bought its last new locomotive, GP750, on February 12, 1953, with a total fleet of 16 units made up of only 3 models of the same vintage from the same builder. The D&AMP-TSL shop forces had become quite expert in keeping them running, and the units were extremely well maintained. The 3 non-MU equipped SW7s were used on locals, transfers, and bum jobs, while the SW9s generally would stay on the hump. The 10 Geeps handled transfer and all road assignments. Since power for the road jobs was pooled with the GTW, colorful Geeps, GP38s and SD40s of that road were common sights on Shoreline road jobs and in the Lang Yard engine facility. For the bicentennial, Shoreline 46 was renumbered 76 and adored in a very handsome red, white and blue paint scheme. The above information was taken from the articles The Detroit and AMP, Toledo Shoreline, and Steam on the Shoreline from the July 1981 issue of Railfan and Railroad, both by Charles H. Jeletsky, Jr.